this is their sacred land and appreciate that we are here, and are heartened that their voices are being heard more in recent years, especially by scientists and managers, because they have generations and generations of knowledge about the Salish Sea and the surrounding land, about the orcas, the salmon, and that knowledge is being appreciated and used more by scientists, considered more. And so many of the tribes are doing wonderful and amazing things to provide stewardship of our land and our resources. So we just want to acknowledge that those generations of them living and caring for these lands, and hopeful that we can try to be good stewards as well in the generations ahead along with them. And I also wanted to acknowledge, given what our country is going through with the racial inequality finally bubbling into the mainstream media and everybody's minds and lives where it should be, in finally getting the attention it needs. And wanting to just have us all think about how we can find ways to diversify everything we do in our environmental work, or whatever work you do, to reach a more diverse audience and to engage a more diverse cross-section of people in all that we do. And I would also like to have a moment of silence for all those who have died in that struggle, and also for all of the people who have died during the COVID pandemic and their families around the world. It tends to get sometimes pushed to the side because there's so much else going on in the world right now, but so many lives have been lost and families affected, and jobs, and you know, it's very far reaching, and it's gonna be around for a while. So I would like to just take a moment of silence before we begin to think about all of those issues, and just send out whatever thoughts, prayers, and think about maybe what we can do to help. So if we could just have a moment of silence. Okay, thank you for joining us in that. Now I know we're going to go on to the issue of pray for Southern residents, which isn't a very happy topic either. But maybe I'll share a little story about our Tibetan bells that I use to end our moment of silence, lighten the mood for a little bit before we go into more depressing news. We had these at our wedding as part of our service, and my grandniece, who was about 1 year old at the time, every time that the bells rang, she very loudly went, uh-oh. And it was just really funny, along with the words of our service and those, you know, the solemnness of getting married. And like, she's like, uh-oh, you guys are making a big mistake. And so it brightened our day. And it's something that I now can't ever hear these bells without thinking about that. So I just wanted to share that and add a little levity. And I know both the video that Monika has and Giles with Eba, the poop sniffing dog, you know, so there will be moments of wonderful things to see with these presentations as well. And it's all very important work that needs to be done. I will let Cindy Hansen, our education and events and advocacy coordinator, go ahead and introduce everyone. I also want to acknowledge and thank Amanda Colbert for painting our whale center, number one. You can see the new color behind her. Being a great education assistant who helps us with a lot of things and helps with the Q&As and gets us through all the world of Zoom. So Cindy, you want to do introductions?
Sure, thank you so much, Susan, for getting us started off that way. Thanks everybody for joining us. I just want to go through a couple of logistics before we get started with our great presentations. For those of you who have not used Zoom before, I assume most of you probably have by now, but if you're not as familiar with it, just a few features to point out. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you kind of scroll your mouse along there, you'll see a chat button. So if you click that, you can actually write in there and talk to everybody, make comments if you want to. So feel free to use that throughout the presentations. However, we will ask if you have questions to use the Q&A. So the way this is going to work is we're going to do the presentations first, and then at the end, we'll have questions for both of our presenters. And so Amanda will be running that part of it. So write your questions as they come up so you don't forget them. You can write them in the Q&A, and then Amanda will read those to the presenters at the end. And the reason we want you to write them in there is because if we use the chat, you're welcome to write questions in there, but they might get lost. There's a lot of other comments, and we want to make sure we get to as many questions as we possibly can. We don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but we'll try to get as many as we can. So just wanted to point those things out. Feel free to use the chat and Q&A. We do have everybody muted, but at the end of the Q&A, if there are still questions that people are interested in asking verbally, we can unmute you and let you ask the questions at that point. So with that said, I think we are ready to get started. I want to thank both of our presenters for being here today. We have Monika Wieland Shields from Orca Behavior Institute and Dr. Deborah Giles, who goes by Giles, from Wild Orca and the Conservation Canine Program at the University of Washington. And I believe we are going to have a special guest at some point making an appearance, who I'm sure you're all very, very eager to see. So we'll do that a little bit later in the presentations. So we'll start with Monika, and Monika's with the Orca Behavior Institute. I'll let her talk a little bit more about what she does there and a little bit of her background. And then what we're going to be discussing today, obviously, are salmon and orcas and what that connection is and what we can possibly do to make things a little bit better for them. I'll turn it over to you, Monika. Thanks so much for being here.
All right, thank you, Cindy. And I'm new to presenting on Zoom, so I'll trust you to interrupt and tell me if something isn't working on the technology side here. But I'm Monika Wieland Shields from the Orca Behavior Institute, which we started in 2015. And our mission is to conduct non-invasive behavioral and acoustic research on killer whales of the Salish Sea, so both southern residents and Biggs killer whales. And one of our initial motivations was to try and track some of these long-term trends that we were seeing in this rapidly changing environment and to put some data behind what we were kind of anecdotally observing here. And so before I go into too much detail, we decided to start with a video that we just posted on the Orca Behavior Institute YouTube channel yesterday, but it fits really well into this topic. So before I say any more, we will start with that. This is the essence of the southern residents right here. These big social groups in Harrow Strait. I mean, when we think of J's, K's, and L's, that's what we think of, is them on the west side of San Juan Island. And they're known for being these really surface active whales that swim close to shore through the kelp beds off Limekiln State Park. And these summer afternoons of the whales doing the west side shuffle and them going north and south, and there's nothing like that feeling of sitting on the rocks and seeing that line of whales approaching. And that's how I fell in love with the southern residents. That's how so many people fell in love with the southern residents. You know, I was a high school student out interning and making acoustic recordings at the lighthouse, and there was a whole crew of us out there that would spend our summers at the lighthouse, and when the whales would come, we'd all scramble down onto the rocks together, and you didn't want to leave because you might miss something. So that meant taking a nap on the rocks with the ID guide underneath you and waking up to climb up to the top of the lighthouse and watch the next pass by. And when we did occasionally watch pass-bys from up there, it was an amazing perspective looking down on these whales as they swam by right at our feet. And we used to talk about the 3-star pass-by, one of those super pods in the kelp. I love telling the story about June 2002 when we came up here and spent the last 2 weeks of June here on San Juan Island, and in 13 days I saw the whales on 12 of those days, 22 pass-bys, 3 super pods, and all from the west side of San Juan Island. And it was just incredible. And even when we started the Orca Behavior Institute in 2015, and we got our boat in the water at the beginning of June, and it was June 9th, and we headed out on our vessel Serenity, and we encountered J-pod and a big portion of L-pod socializing off False Bay. And you can see the smiles speak for themselves. It was an incredible encounter, and that's what we had dreamed of as we watched the whales on the west side of San Juan Island, was getting out there and experiencing those same things from a research perspective. And even as recently as a few years ago, you know, you could go out to Limekiln for a summer sunset and fully expect that the whales might show up, or they could surprise you coming around the lighthouse like they did on this particular evening, just slowly swimming through the kelp beds. And that's what summer on San Juan Island was all about. And all the rest of the year you would dream about those summer evenings and those super pod encounters at Limekiln. And I just went back and looked through my notes, and the last super pod at Limekiln was in September of 2016. June 20th, 2020, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, we would have expected to see the southern residents dozens of times by now here at Limekiln. This year, haven't seen them once. We knew this trend was happening when we published our first paper in 2018. It was about the declining spring usage of the Salish Sea by the southern residents, particularly in the months of April through June. And it was something that had been dropping off since 2005, kind of first in April and then a little more in May and then a little more in June. But we never thought it would get to a point like this, where this year there was a single sighting of J-pod on the evening of April 10th up in the Strait of Georgia. But other than that, look at those red X's piling up. Virtually not here in April, not here in May, and not here in June as the days continue to tick off the calendar. It's crazy to sit here and think about what it used to be like
it wasn't that long ago that we were coming down here all the time to see the southern residents, and I would always tell people second half of June, that's the best time to come and see them here, and you can just sit at Lime Kiln for a couple days and you're practically guaranteed to see them. And then now it's just been declining, and they're here less and less until last year. It was the first June on record when the southern residents weren't in the Salish Sea at all, and it really feels like we're headed towards the second June this year. And it's kind of scary how quickly we've sort of gotten used to that. Like, nobody's talking about when they're going to return because we don't really expect them to return. And when I sit and think about it, it's just like a punch to the gut. And it's not hard to see what's going on if you take a look at the average Albion catch per unit effort numbers, which is a Fraser River Chinook test fishery for the month of May. Look at the correlation between the fish numbers in green and the whale presence in the Salish Sea in blue. And then you see the big fish drop off in 2005 and the whales follow suit, declining until not here in 2018 in the month of May and again in 2020. Here's the same thing looking at the month of June with the Fraser River Chinook numbers in green and the southern resident presence in blue. And you'll see the big drop off of fish in 2005 and the whale sightings start to decline, dropping pretty sharply until they weren't here at all in 2019 and possibly again in 2020. So what are people doing with this data? Well, unfortunately, both sides of the border are continuing to spend a lot of time talking about vessel effects, in particular small vessels. In Washington State, the biggest activity this year is the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife conducting a process about licensing commercial whale watching vessels to establish limitations for their time and distance spent around the southern residents. And it sounds great on paper, but we've been through this vessel rulemaking several times now since the endangered listing of the whales, and it seems a little ridiculous, quite frankly, at times to be talking about additional vessel regulations around whales that aren't even here. And on the Canadian side of the border, they're doing a little bit better, but it's a lot of the same thing. So the whole orange area on this map is distance restrictions about approaching the southern residents. The small red zones are interim sanctuary zones, which are basically no-go zones for boats. And then the yellow regions are seasonal fishery closures, so no fishing can happen in those areas. And the thing that I like most about this is that the orange protection area kind of extends out the western Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is where the whales are spending a lot of their time in the late spring and throughout the summer. As far as we know, we get a few reports of them out there. So that region makes a little bit more sense. But again, this is primarily about vessels. There's some regional fishing closures, but fishing can still happen everywhere else. And it doesn't really matter if there aren't many fish there to begin with. While I've been sitting here on the rocks, a friend just sent me a link to an article that was published yesterday by CBC saying that Ottawa is taking unprecedented action to protect Fraser River Chinook salmon on behalf of the southern resident killer whales. That's great news. That's exactly what we want to be seeing. But when I looked into the details of it, it includes some fishing area closures and some size restrictions on the Chinook that you can keep. But one of the major pieces of the rule is that you can't fish within 1,000 meters of a killer whale when they're in the Salish Sea. But is it really a harvest production if you can't fish within 1,000 meters of a killer whale that's not here? It's, you know, we're finally starting to talk a little bit about fish, but these aren't the kind of big actions that we need, and we need to be talking about habitat and major salmon recovery. And until we figure out how to recover Chinook salmon on the Fraser River, the southern residents aren't going to return to the Salish Sea very often, and encounters like this on the west side of Salmon Island will remain a memory. And it's so frustrating that nobody's talking about the fact that the whales aren't here and why they aren't here. And looking at footage of encounters like these, it's just heartbreaking.
Okay, I'm just gonna switch here to some PowerPoint slides. So it's a tough story to tell. It's not a happy story to tell that the whales aren't here. You know, we haven't seen the southern residents on the west side at all this year. The few times we did see them earlier in the year, they were either down in Puget Sound or they came down into San Juan Channel or up in the Strait of Georgia, but none of those sort of traditional west side pass-bys. And I just have a couple slides prepared here to show you some of the data in a few different ways. So this is the main graph from the paper that was mentioned in the video. So in light blue are the escapement numbers for Fraser River spring Chinook runs. And so this is looking primarily then at April through June, and the southern resident presence in dark blue. And you can see this decline over the last 20 plus years in both of those. Extending it out to look at April through September, we've also seen this decline going back to kind of the early 2000s, when over that several month time period, the whales would be here 150 plus days. And then dropping off in 2013, you can see was kind of the real wake up call when we started to realize the whales weren't spending as much time here anymore. And then a little bit of a peak there in 2015, coinciding kind of with the baby boom, interestingly enough, and then dropping off again until 2019 was the lowest on record in terms of number of days the southern residents were in the inland waters from April through September. And we've kind of noticed that the drop-off, you know, started early in the year. First sightings started to reduce in April, with 2009 being the first year on record when there were no southern residents in the Salish Sea in the month of April. And then that happened again in 2013. Then things started really slowing down in May, with 2018 being the first year without them here in May. And that happened again this year. And then last year, the first June, and July has been going way down as well. And so far, August and September have been a little bit stronger in terms of both fish numbers and the whale presence here, but it's just continuing to shrink, and it's shrinking from the spring and extending into the summer. So this is another way of looking at that same data. So looking at 2019 and how much the whales were here April through September, how many days compared to that historic average going back to the 10 years kind of prior to when the Chinook crashes started. And you can see, you know, they were May, June, July, that was the prime time, with the June average being something like 28 or 29 days of the month they were here. And that was the regular, you know, that's what we expected. So to not have them here at all in the month of June is just, it's shocking, really. And like I mentioned in the video, it's hard to believe that hardly anybody is talking about that. And, you know, we're seeing some news articles about some of the interim and emergency actions that are being taken, but it's not enough, and it's not big enough compared to the reaction that we're seeing from the whales in terms of them basically abandoning what used to be their core habitat here in the spring and early summer. And all the data up to this point has kind of been looking at southern residents as a whole. But if you break that out, and this is the 2019 data for every month of the year, looking at a J-pod in blue and K-pod in green and L-pod in orange, and kind of the solid darker color is when the entire pod was present, with the fainter color being when only part of the pod was present. And you can see that J-pod continues to be kind of the predominant pod that we see in the Salish Sea. And a lot of those days from when the southern residents are here is just J-pod or part of J-pod. You can see K-pod and L-pod are basically hardly here at all, except for a little bit in kind of the late fall and early winter. And we're really lucky to have this comparative population here in the big killer whales, who of course are just thriving. Their population is growing. and they're spending more and more time in the Salish Sea, and that of course correlates directly to their prey availability. So this graph here is just showing Bigg's killer whale occurrences, which is kind of a way to count how many different social groups of Bigg's killer whales are here throughout the course of a year, taking advantage of a couple different studies that have looked at that. And then comparing that to just one of their prey items, the harbor porpoise population in the inland waters of Washington. Data from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And you can see, again, this really strong correlation where with the southern residents, prey goes down, the whales aren't here. With the Bigg's killer whales, prey goes up, and they're here in just record numbers. And it's incredible to have, you know, these two stories playing out simultaneously in the same habitat and seeing just completely opposite trends of what's going on. And the one, you know, silver lining that I take from this is we worried early on after the Fraser River spring and summer Chinook numbers were crashing was, what if the southern residents stay here? What if this area is so important to them that they continue to come here even if there aren't fish here? So the silver lining is that they have left and are hopefully finding food wherever they are, that they are adapting, and they've realized that this region is not going to sustain them in this time of year anymore. And we can just hope that they've found something where they are. But we talk a lot about coastwide salmon recovery, which is so important, and the lower Snake River dams, which is really important, especially for K&L pods who spend a lot more time on the outer coast and further south on the outer coast. But if we want the southern residents to return to the Salish Sea, where we fell in love with them, where so many of us got to know them and have these special encounters with them, it's really going to be about the Fraser River and the spring and summer Chinook runs there. That's everything I've got prepared for you here. So I think we'll turn it over to Giles.
Thanks so much, Monika. That was great. So we'll have Giles now from Conservation Canines and Wild Orca, and she'll be talking about some of the research that's happening in the Salish Sea with orcas and more. Thanks, Giles.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for having me. And thank you, Monika, for that recap of what's going on. I think it's really important for people to be able to actually see the data and look at the timeframes and how things have changed, relatively speaking, in a very short amount of time. 2013 feels like a long time ago for us, but in the lives of these whales, it's just a blink of an eye. And so to recognize that these whales are having to change behaviors that they have most likely had for certainly decades and decades, but probably through probably hundreds of thousands of years on and off. Certainly since the glaciers retreated 12 to 18,000 years ago, these whales were most likely here. And so to think of that really, really remarkable change is sobering, to say the least. So I'll go ahead and start a PowerPoint. Eva's here and she's actually napping, so I'll let her rest for a while and do my PowerPoint first and then bring her out. So let's see if I can manage to do this. So I pretty much have changed I've done a lot of talks lately. So for some of you, if you've tuned in to me in the last probably 2 months, especially since COVID and since we haven't been able to get out on the water as much as we normally would be at this time because the whales would be around in the past. You may have seen quite a bit of this slideshow, so now might be a good time to go and get a snack or something and then come back for the Q&A. So I do like starting with this slide. This slide was actually taken, this photo was taken around 2012, and it shows what Monika was talking about earlier when she was talking about super pods. This was a day when all three pods were here and all members of the three pods were here. So that's the proper definition of a super pod, when all members of the southern residents are within range of one another, calling range of one another. we've let that terminology slip a little bit, and now people use that term superpod to describe times when just some members of all three pods are here. And I think it's really important to make sure that we're using that term correctly, because it tells us something about how the whales are utilizing their summer core critical habitat or not using their summer core critical habitat, as the case may be. So as Cindy said, I'm with Conservation Canines, which is a program of the Center for Conservation Biology at the University of Washington. And I've been with that program since 2009. And I'm also the Science and Research Director for a nonprofit called Wild Orca. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about our Fair Fisheries campaign in a minute. So there's my email down there at the bottom if anybody has any questions that we don't get to this evening. So everybody probably already knows this, but I love showing this mainly to give, I always like to give UCOs an opportunity to be seen. And I really like this graphic because you actually can see the difference, the size difference, depending on which ecotype we're talking about. We don't get to see offshores in here very much, maybe every, whatever, 10 years or more. They'll cruise through the Salish Sea quickly and then head back out. We do now know from some studies or some research with NOAA that these offshore killer whales, which were always known to be shark eaters, they do eat some fish, and they have been seen in the same proximity as southern resident killer whales foraging at Swiftshore Bank on Chinook salmon. So that's pretty interesting. I like that little tidbit. You can tell from this graphic that the big killer whales, the mammal-eating guys in the middle, are bigger, especially the males. And just over time, they've become a bit more robust in the jaw because of the prey that they eat. But also, when you see them physically, especially by drone, boy, these guys are just incredibly different shaped. And that's because they are so filled out. They're what we should be seeing, really fat killer whales. Whereas the southern residents, Dave Ellifrit from the Center for Whale Research describes the southern residents now as being puny. And I think that is the case. Certainly a lot smaller even than they used to be when the drones or the aerial photos back in 2008 first started happening. So I'll just move quickly to our research. The southern residence range is still amazingly being debated at the federal level. We do expect this to be solidified at some point here, where the critical habitat will extend all the way down to actually beyond Monterey just a little bit. But really what we focus on here with our study is this area in yellow up there. So the summer core critical habitat already designated in the US and Canada for the southern resident killer whales. And for our boat that goes out of Snug Harbor right here on the west side of San Juan Island, this is essentially our range. We may be extending down here to Puget Sound, South Puget Sound, down into the Seattle area in September, because that's where the whales are spending more and more time in the month of September, at least for the last 2 years. And I expect it to be the same this year. And also out to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, ideally we would be out there right now, because they have the, as very recently in the last couple of days, L-pod and K-pod have been seen at Swiftshore Bank, which is about where my cursor is here, foraging together just in the last couple of days. So it sure would be nice to be able to get out there, but it's challenging for all kinds of reasons. But ultimately, we'd like to extend the project out there as well. So the southern residents listed in this country in 2005, well behind the Species at Risk Act listing in Canada in 2001. And as Monika identified, the lack of quality and quantity prey being the most significant issue facing these animals. And certainly toxicants into the marine realm and up the food chain are impacted by the lack of salmon. And then the vessel presence and associated noise. I show this picture here from Captain Niles because this is showing this whale in very close proximity to this ocean-going container ship that are, these numbers are getting more and more with these boats going back and forth, taking raw materials from North America over to Asia, where they're bringing back finished goods. So lots and lots of vessel traffic. And I always tell people especially if I'm on land and talking with people watching whales and we can see, or even not watching whales, if we can see these large ships in the distance anywhere within sight, their noise signature has the potential to mask the whale's ability to echolocate and find food. And so all of these things work together in a negative synergy to create pretty much the perfect storm of threats facing this population. So I show this as often as I can to as many people as possible, because it's a good reminder to say why these whales only eat fish, and specifically why they target Chinook salmon. These whales co-evolved with Pacific salmon that would have been massive, over 100 pounds. The fish on the left was 116 pounds, the fish on the right, 121 pounds. And just this week, or actually just last week, because it's Monday here, last week I checked on WDFW, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife website, and they currently state that the average size Chinook salmon in Washington state is 10 to 15 pounds. So for a whale that in the past, who evolved eating Chinook salmon, for a whale that would have had to have caught 3 or maybe 4 of these a day to take care of their caloric needs, which the estimate is between 300 and 400 pounds of food per day per whale. Imagine how much they have to forage now to find fish that are just 10 or 15 pounds, and how much energy they're expending to catch that fish. And just going back in time a little bit, this is sockeye salmon, but the same thing happened to Chinook salmon. These men are knee deep in salmon that were being processed at a cannery. And, you know, this was the start of a lot of bad mistakes that humans made, essentially to do everything in our power to eliminate wild salmon from the Pacific Northwest. And ultimately have detrimental impacts for over 120 species that rely on salmon. And of course, the southern residents being the top of that pyramid, being heavily, heavily impacted by the loss of the biodiversity and the biomass that would have occurred going up these rivers. So this is another chart that I've said in the past has been, if I had just one chart to show to anybody, it would be this chart, and it's just slightly out of date here, just up to 2018. But this is really showing the coast-wide abundance of Chinook salmon that the whales would be relying on. These are rivers throughout the southern residence range. And when we have low numbers of salmon, we have high numbers of southern resident killer whale deaths. It really is the whole story in one picture. And thanks to Jane Kogan working with the Center for Whale Research data, as well as data compiled from the Pacific Salmon Commission themselves, are the ones that put out these data here with the fish. So a lot of the problem, you know, Monika was talking about in her talk that it's essential for us to recover Fraser River Chinook salmon if we expect to see southern residents in their summer core critical habitat in the future. And really that is absolutely the truth. And in order to recover any Pacific salmon, we have to really get a handle on what's happening in the Alaskan fishery. So this is a commercial fishery and some recreational fishery, but mainly commercial. I'm talking about fishery that occurs in Alaska, because only 3% of Alaska, fish caught in Alaska are actually native to Alaska. That's this purple bar right here at the bottom. Very, very small numbers of Chinook salmon caught in the salmon troll in Alaska are actually native to Alaska. All of these other fish are fish that would be bound for and would have been reared in and then bound for their spawning activity in waters, in rivers in BC, Canada, Washington, and Oregon. And this is just another way of looking at that same data. And so right here are this in blue are the fish that are from Alaska, from Alaskan rivers that are actually caught in Alaska. Those fish may or may not be sustainably harvested. The rest of all these fish that are caught in the Alaskan troll are, it's questionable whether or not they're sustainable, because quite a number of these fish runs that are up there, these fish that are in Alaska getting big and getting ready to make their migration back home, are caught there. And so if we look at Fraser River, this is this sliver here, that's a fair amount of fish that would have been bound for that river. Here we have the Columbia, just over a quarter of the fish caught in Alaska are actually Columbia bound fish. And so all of these fish here are incredibly important for the Southern residents' recovery and overall, well-being in the future. So this is Monika showed this as well, just another way to see it again, or a reminder to see it again, with just absolutely no fish caught in May in the Albion test fishery. And that's why we don't have any Southern residents here. There's just no fish to bring them in. So the way that we're looking at that, our research focuses on utilizing scat because it's such a gold mine of information. And this project, this type of work, was pioneered by this man, Dr. Sam Wasser. He's the endowed chair for the Center for Conservation Biology at University of Washington. And in 1997, he came up with this idea of utilizing scent detection dogs to sniff out endangered species fecal samples in order to be able to collect a tremendous amount of data without disrupting or stressing the animals out. So we use dogs to find killer whale poop. Because it's non-invasive, we can stay really far away from the animals. The amount of information, again, is vast. I'll go over that in a second. And it minimizes sampling bias, which is important. Give a shout out to the team. Dr. Wasser leads this team. I've been very fortunate in life since 2009 to be a part of this project. Sadie Youngstrom is our really amazing crew member. Unfortunately, I can't have any crew on board right now. I miss having her out there. We have a great time, and I feel we do great work together, along with just a host of people that come out and volunteer with us. So I'm looking forward to COVID changing so that we can be back out there, our regular team be back out there. In the meantime, my husband, Jim Rappold, has stepped up and is able to go out with me on the boat. And thank goodness, because it allows us to continue this work through the COVID period, collecting fecal samples on the animals in the Salish Sea. And then Iba, the whale dog. She used to be called Iba the orca dog, but now we have expanded to cover other species. And so here she is in her glory. And just really quickly, I think I'm running out of time, so I'll just fly through these, just showing people what these dogs look like when they're just relaxed on the front of the boat. This is our former colleague, Colette, and our dog, Dio. But you can see Dio and Iba have the exact same stance. They're just kind of hanging out there, just sniffing around. They're working. As long as they're on the bow, they're working. But as soon as they get a scent, they change their behavior, and they all have different behaviors. We can talk about that some other time, but essentially it's our job, the handler and the driver, to learn how to interpret the behavior change in these animals and then be able to act on that. And ultimately, the dogs take us through a series of maneuvering back and forth along the boat. They take us in this zigzag pattern right to the sample. So this is what Iba, not a lot of people get to see what our dogs look like when they get their reward. So here's just a quick video of Iba getting to play after finding a sample earlier this year.
Yeah, Iba did it. Good job. Girl.
So that's what she works for. It doesn't look like much to us, but boy, that is exactly what she wants to. She just lifted her head up too. I think she heard herself playing and wanted to know what was going on. So this is what we're looking for. This is what we're working for. And Iba is working to get to play with her toy. These are old samples. We don't get to see these kinds of samples anymore. Very, very rarely. We only had two of our samples last year in 2019 were anywhere near as big as this. This is what a healthy whale, a whale with a lot of fat to give up, essentially, this is what the scat looks like. And now we're lucky if we find something about that big. When we do collect it, it goes to the lab, and thank goodness for our amazing lab team down at the University of Washington, because they're the ones that do the work that doesn't get recognized enough, and are, in my opinion, stuck in a lab, although they love it. But these are some of the things that we look at. So who pooped the way, who left us a sample, and if it's a female, if she's pregnant, and if she's pregnant, how pregnant. Also, all kinds of things about different toxicants that might be found in the scat sample. Most recently, we've been sharing some of our samples with NOAA, and Kim Parsons has recently come out with a paper showing 100% of the samples that she's analyzed. So that's our samples that we've collected, as well as samples that Brad Hansen and Candy Evans have collected. All of the samples have microplastics in them. Also, the next newest thing that we're going to be looking at is gut biome. So all of these things we can look at, and the bigger the sample, the better. This is kind of a fun one here. This is most likely, I don't actually know, but my guess is that that's actually a snot sample out of the blowhole. And then sometimes we just find other parasites that we collect and have analyzed as well. So this is a little out of date, 5 years out of date. It's even worse than this, as we saw from the graph earlier, but just showing you over time the comparisons of how much the fish has declined over the years. This is Fraser River. This is what would have been bringing the whales in. And you can really see 13, 14, 15, where the numbers are just really, really low. This was a study that came out of our samples. Dr. Lundeen is now with NOAA, and this was essentially showing, we knew it to be the case, but this was a good way to prove it, just showing as the whales are not getting enough to eat, they're circulating the toxins because they're burning their blubber. And we know from human studies that when mammals are detoxing, which is essentially what these whales are doing all of the time when they're burning their fat stores, it makes them more susceptible to disease. You do have a suppressed immune system, especially when that fasting or starvation goes on for long periods of time. So I'm going to get through this a little faster just so that we've got more time for questions. Our biggest paper, most recent paper, came out in 2017 showing 69% of females that got pregnant from the samples that we collected. 69% of those females lost their pregnancy before the baby was born alive, or just right after the baby was born. And then this is something that we're continuing to analyze, and still hoping to get some samples from our colleagues to be able to look at how often these individual females are losing calves. And J56, last time that animal was seen, was healthy. That animal was the result of this, at least the 7th pregnancy by J31. And so we think about, you know, we see J35 carrying around her dead neonate for 17 days. And it makes you stop and think, when you've got these animals that are continuously losing their babies, what kind of physical toll is that taking on them? And also what kind of emotional toll is that taking on these females that continuously lose babies? And again, this is just samples that we've collected. So it stands to reason that more females have been pregnant and lost their calves, and we just didn't happen to get a sample from them in that year. So quickly, we are collecting transient whale feces as well. We collected this monster last year, no idea what it is yet. It is in the lab now. And our lab technician, our new grad student, Will, is analyzing all of our samples from 2019 pretty much as we speak. So that'll be interesting to see what on earth this was. And then we are collecting humpback whale feces as well. This is an interesting story. So Ken Ray, Captain Ken Ray, sent me this photo last year, or actually in January, for a talk I gave at Orca Network's Ways of Whales. This was a poop that a humpback whale named Heather left, and he got this beautiful picture of it. And turns out she came back with a calf. So man, I sure wish I would have gotten a sample of this fecal sample. for analysis, because it would have been really cool to be able to do the same sorts of pregnancy analysis that we do with Southern residents on humpbacks, which is our plan, but anyhow, next time. And we were, Cindy from Orca Network, and I were so ready to go down and collect gray whale feces in and around Whidbey Island. Really, we were about 3 days away from heading over there. We had a place to stay, and we're just finishing up some details about where to dock the boat and such like that. But then we had our closure, our state closure, on the 23rd of March, and so that was put on hold. But ideally, we would be able to collect some gray whale feces to get some idea about what on earth is happening with these sounders, these guys that keep coming back. Not only these guys, but some of the new gray whales that are starting to show up and have come brand new this year. We did work with the Center for Whale Research last year, piloting with Michael Weiss here. He was piloting his boat-based drone study, and he did help us find 2 minke whale fecal samples in the water, but boy, did that get dispersed quickly. And not at all like this beautiful blue whale poop. That'd be nice, but I don't think we'll ever see minke whale feces look like this. But we'll keep looking. And then just a little shout out to Disney's newest princess. Eva had her debut on Disney last month, and this is the show. Come here. Everybody wants to see you. Oh my goodness. So I think I'm almost done here, and then we can say hi to Eva. Oh, a great shout out to even just some of our crew. Sharon Grace has been with us since 2009, going out as often as possible. I've had great help from Aaron Cora with folks here on the island earlier this year. And then Caroline Armand and JB, just fantastic people that have come out and helped us. And then our team at Pack Forest, there's Dr. Wasser and Tammy Rock, and Julianne and Rachel, our team at Pack Forest that help keep the dogs, the other dogs going. And then Keely, she's kind of our den mom. She keeps everything in the office going. And we have a new teammate named Dan Phillips. I don't have a picture of him up here yet. I need to make that happen. So we're glad to have him aboard. And thanks to our funders, we'd be no place right now if it wasn't for Vulcan. They stepped up at the beginning of 2019 and funded us. And then some extra money from Fish and Wildlife, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation recently to get us out there in this slow period. And then Whale and Dolphin Conservation. And then the ones at the bottom are former funders who hopefully will fund us again. So thanks much. I'm gonna stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Giles. That was great. Hi, Eva. How are you? Did she just wake up?
Barely. There she is.
All right. I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to do the Q&A. So again, if you do have questions, please write them in the Q&A, and Amanda will get them to the appropriate panelist. And we'll turn it over to her.
Awesome, thank you. So the first question here, it's not necessarily directed at either one of you, so maybe both of you can weigh in here. But the first question is, can you speak about the proportional risks, impacts of prey availability, toxics, and vessel traffic?
Do you want to go ahead and take a stab, Monica?
Sure. Well, as Giles outlined in her presentation, prey is clearly the primary issue, and then that issue is exacerbated by the compounding effects of the toxin loads the whales are carrying and the vessel effects that they experience. So I think in terms of their ranking, we know that prey is most important, and then the other ones are compounding that and potentially making it worse. What has been interesting to observe in the COVID era is we had the huge reduction of vessel traffic in the Salish Sea. We had whale watching completely stop for 2.5 months. And then depending on whether you're looking at the US or Canadian numbers, anywhere from a 10 to 30% reduction in large commercial shipping traffic as well. So there was, there were still vessels on the water. It wasn't quite the quiet seascape that some of the media headlines made it sound like, but there was a significant reduction in vessel activity in the Salish Sea over the last few months. And it was kind of an interesting case study, I think, to see if that alone would be enough to bring the whales back. And I think the answer is pretty clearly no, it's not. That we can't, it's not worth our effort to be addressing vessels and toxins unless we're taking serious effort to address prey. And I think we've seen that in the last couple of months, and I think we've seen that since the endangered listing as well. So it's, all three are important, but without the prey piece, the rest of it doesn't matter.
The only thing I'd add to that is that we do know, I don't think I mentioned this, but the females of those 69% of females that lost their calves, those females were nutritionally subpar. So these are females that were not getting enough nutrition in addition to the, and so we believe it's in the paper that it's the lack of nutrition is what caused, most likely what caused the pregnancy failures.
All right. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Again, it's not particularly for either one of you, so whomever wants to weigh in here, but it says, how does actually it is, Giles. How does Orca scat sampling differ from the sampling methods in terms of minimizing sampling bias?
So unless we're behind an individual animal, we don't know who pooped it out until it's in the lab. And what some research in the past has accidentally or whatever, it's easier to follow a male killer whale. They're bigger, you have more time seeing them come up. It takes them longer to actually get the dorsal fin up out of the water and back down. And so some research is very, very heavily focused on male killer whales. Particularly some behavioral studies from the past have been fairly focused on males. Again, just because they're easier to see, they're much bigger animals. This way, we're not targeting any one animal. We don't get anywhere near the whales. We don't start transecting behind the whales until they're 300 or 400 meters past us, and then we go in and operate the boat downwind of their path. And so it's kind of an interesting, occasionally we'll know, we'll get notes from, say, Michael Weiss, when he was on board with us last year, he could actually say, oh, it was so-and-so that pooped that sample out, which was actually pretty cool to know beforehand who it was. But generally speaking, we don't have that. And so we are getting a nice cross section of samples from many, many, many different members of the community.
Awesome. Thanks. And then this one says, what steps has NOAA taken from the research you've provided to help southern resident killer whales? And this came in during your talk, Giles, but it would be great if both of you had an opportunity to answer that.
So what has been done because of the studies? I would say that our study is more, our studies have come out that have been more used for support for guidelines or laws that have gone into, guidelines have been codified into law. I think one of the cool ones that showed, so Jessica Lundeen, who was Sam's second grad student, one of her papers was about PAH. So it's basically the smog that comes off of boats. And we had samples from before the distance guideline became a law. So when boats could be 100 yards away from whales to when the boats had to stay 200 yards away from whales in the US. And that study was really cool because it showed that that extra distance diminished the PAH or the smog that those whales were breathing in and then ultimately pooping out. It declined to safe levels. And so that showed that, giving that distance was a good thing to have happen. And I think that's kind of conservation biology at its best, showing how either science helps guide policy or science that comes out supports policy that is in place. And I think that that's absolutely what we need to be looking at. And so by kind of extension, we know that these animals are hungry. We need to therefore be focusing our attention on increasing the prey base, the quality and quantity of fish that are available for them. So again, allowing science to drive management is kind of one of the basic tenets of conservation biology, which you know, I think what we do helps support that.
Yeah, unfortunately it can take a lot longer than many of us would like for the science to work its way through the gears of policymaking, and so I'm hopeful that all the studies that have come out in the last 5 and 10 years will contribute in an important way to the policy that we need, and that the rules and the regulations that we need and the recovery efforts going forward. In terms of our research, in particular, our study about the declining presence of the southern residents in the spring has been used and cited in the arguments for extending the critical habitat to include the outer coast, because it suggests that they're in the Salish Sea less, therefore they're using the rest of their habitat even more than they were previously. So the hope is, as Giles mentioned, that critical habitat extension, including the outer coast, will come sooner rather than later, because it seems to be an increasingly important region for the killer whales year round, not just in the winter.
All right, thanks. So this one's for both of you. It says, how would we go about getting involved with volunteer work?
Yeah, there's so many organizations in this area that are involved with killer whale and salmon recovery that I think there's a lot of opportunities to get involved, kind of regardless of where you live in the Salish Sea, including Orca Network and Whale Scout. I always like to give a shout out to as well for their habitat recovery events that they hold. Is a really great way to get engaged. In terms of the Orca Behavior Institute, we do offer an internship, a student internship each year. And so every fall we consider applicants for that to give people field experience doing research and helping to mentor research projects for primarily master's students, but we consider students of all ages as well.
I always give a shout out to Whale Scout as well and Orca Network, because these are organizations that are putting people on the ground, right, kind of like really getting people involved with what's happening. So right now, Whale Scout's a bit on hold, but you can sign up with them to do habitat restoration work. Kind of the concept is trees for whales, really just physically getting out there and planting trees, and then being, a scout, learning how to be a land-based naturalist. Orca Network has a vast network of people that do that land-based naturalizing down kind of Whidbey South. If you're in and around the San Juan Islands, the San Juan Island Naturalist Program is another group that you can get involved with to volunteer to be a naturalist. We'll train you up, and then we're not wanting necessarily folks from off island to participate in this necessarily right now because of COVID. But ultimately, certainly if you're a San Juan Islander, we would love to snatch you up and educate you about how to be a land-based naturalist at the Westside Preserve. And then also we're co-working Erin Cora with Folks. She's one of the primary people that are behind that. So this is kind of a group. San Juan Island Naturalist Program is an umbrella group that houses a lot of different nonprofits: Orca Network, Wild Orca, I'm totally spacing, Folks, and Whale Scout, and I'm missing somebody, and I apologize for that. But we, our different groups kind of plug in the information that we can provide to naturalists. We educate people, and then we place them along the west side of San Juan. We were ready to expand to the county park, and do West Side County Park kind of evening campfire cookout, s'mores, and learn about whales. We were going to do that in 2020. Unfortunately, that got foiled, but we will do that in 2021. So there's a lot of different groups that you can get involved with to physically place yourself on the landscape in order to pass on the information that you have gained. Because ultimately, that's what it boils down to, is being able to be educated and then pass on the knowledge that you have to your friends and family, and then get engaged in the political system. There's really truly nothing better that you as an individual can do than actually take the time to vote, educate yourself, and then vote. I can't say this enough or as strongly. If you're, we have to all be voting for people who have the environment as a main platform that they stand on and that they care about. Because if we don't, if we're electing people into office that have the power to roll back important environmental laws like we are seeing right now, the whales and quite frankly, we don't have a chance of survival. And so utilizing your opportunity to vote is truly one of the best things that you can do as an individual. Educate, pass on your education, and then vote, vote, vote.
Thanks. So another question is, why can't we farm Chinook salmon before these beautiful whales become extinct?
You want me to take that?
Go for it.
Yeah, so there are some moves to farm salmon for killer whales that are really well intended. I think the intention is right and the desperation is true and reasonable. The problems are the environmental impacts to farming salmon. And that's whether or not you're doing it in the marine realm or you're doing it on land. Certainly, in my opinion, the land-based farming of fish, I mean, just that, trying to say that is hard because it's so against nature. It's so the opposite of the epitome of what salmon are. And I would actually venture to say that besides killer whales, salmon are the most amazing creatures on the planet. And to put them in a pen takes away the thing that makes them salmon. But even still, to the environmental impacts that are involved with farming salmon, I do not believe have been mitigated enough. They haven't been discussed enough, and we haven't come up with mitigation measures to limit the environmental impact that farmed salmon have. And so ultimately, that's a sad second or third or fourth option. We need to be rather looking at fisheries management issues. We need to be getting a very clear handle on where and when and how we fish. Mixed open fishing that is indiscriminate in what we're catching can't be allowed to continue in the way that it's continuing. We need to start to think about fishing in a way that is more in line with the way that that native, folks in US and Canada used to fish, where they're fishing in or at the river mouth, where we have a better handle on what the fish are that are coming back, and allowing for the genetic diversity to continue in those wild populations. Farming fish is just such a it's like the last resort. And I know that's hard to say because these whales are starving. And for those of us that research them, those of us that have just loved them for our whole lives, it's hard. It's really hard, but we need to take that pain that we're feeling and turn that into getting active. Insert yourself into the Pacific Fisheries Management Council meetings. They're open to the public. People are allowed to go. People are allowed to comment. And we need to see just a tsunami of people getting involved in these issues from Southeast Alaska all the way down to California, because all of the fish matter to the whales. And then get involved with habitat restoration. Help purchase land that hasn't been degraded. Habitat restoration is a poor second option. habitat preservation is the most important thing that we need to be doing. And so that's super long-winded, but I'm not 100% against the idea. I just have not heard any plans in place that feel like and that read like they have come up with mitigation measures to take care of the potential harm that sort of situation might bring.
I agree with everything you just said, and the one thing that I would add to that is the potential impacts on the killer whales as well, from becoming dependent on essentially being fed by humans, and what would that do to them, and who they are as killer whales, and how they are meant to survive. And it's a very unknown realm, but from some studies of provisioning dolphins, bottlenose dolphins in other areas, there's been impacts on the fertility of the whales that are fed, and their success at raising their own young. And it's a huge can of worms. And I understand how on the surface it feels like an immediate action that we could take, but it does have its whole own host of problems. And I agree with what Giles said, that we need to be focusing on systemic solutions and not just Band-Aid solutions.
Thanks to both of you. So the next one, there are a couple questions kind of intertwined here. The first is the count for Southern residents still currently 72? I don't think we've heard anything other than that recently. Is that correct? So 72, and that's if they do confirm that L41 is gone. The next one is, did mining start in Alaska? And if so, has it affected salmon numbers? Giles,
I'm guessing you're talking about the Pebble mine, and that so far has not started. That is a battle that I think a lot of people thought had been, won. And it's just resurfaced. And so people need to get engaged in that issue again. Absolutely.
All right, and then the third kind of writer on this question was, do we know if the Southern residents were in Alaska during our lockdown here at all when commercial fishing was happening? I didn't think so.
I don't think we have any type of recent sightings of the Southern residents in Alaska. But like Giles kind of showed in her presentation, the real impact of the fishery is not necessarily directly taking fish out of the mouths of the Southern residents, but impacting the fish that are returning to the rivers that the Southern residents rely on. So whether the whales are physically there or not, those fisheries are impacting the populations of salmon that the Southern residents rely on down here.
All right, and another question, is it too time-consuming and expensive to make the orca immunized to any kind of illness caused by toxic material? Or is it just best to keep the orca from burning this fat in the first place?
Yeah, I absolutely feel like the most important thing we need to be doing is just making sure that they're getting enough to eat. The idea of immunizing them or bolstering their immune system by medicine, again, these are measures, these are roads that we don't want to go down. The more important thing to be focusing on, I mean, in a lot of ways, it feels like a Band-Aid. It feels like a cop-out by just saying, well, we'll just immunize them or we can just feed them. That's not dealing with the fundamental issues at hand. And so, yeah, a well-fed whale is what we want to have. And to get a well-fed whale, we need to be recovering wild Chinook salmon stocks wherever possible, and then supplementing regions with hatchery salmon when those hatcheries salmon do not impact wild Chinook salmon. We just really need to be focusing our energy on that when we're starting to think about, I've heard people say, let's just take them all into captivity and feed them. Or let's take ones that are starving out of their habitat and feed them and then put them back. That is absolutely not dealing with the issue, the stem of the problem. And so I just feel like there's a lot of wasted energy. It's well-intended energy for the most part from people, but we just need to get on the same page and recognize that our actions have had dire consequences for the whales and for the ecosystems that they rely on. And we have the capacity, we have the knowledge about how to roll back some of that damage. We're just not doing it. We're not taking those political actions. And so while it feels like, oh gosh, maybe they need a shot to, get them over this hump, it's longer term than that. This is a lifelong situation that these whales are dealing with. And so we need to be dealing with it at a base level. And then these whales are resilient. If we just give them a little bit of help, if we just back off a little bit of the impacts that we keep piling on them, I do believe that they have the resiliency to rebound.
And I kind of feel the same way about the way the last 15 years of recovery efforts have gone, as to some of these more immediate and on the surface easier sounding actions. And I get the desire for an immediate solution, but we keep talking about how these salmon recovery efforts are big and hard and long term. But if we had started them 15 years ago, where would we and the Southern residents be today? And I would just hate to be sitting here 15 years from now with 20 fewer whales in the population and saying, if only we had started that 15 years ago. And I think it's time to tackle those hard issues. And if we want the Southern residents, that's it. That's what we have to do.
There's a saying, I don't know where it's from, I should look it up, but the saying goes, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time to plant a tree is today. And that's the same thing that can be said for salmon recovery. Taking major steps for recovering salmon in all different ways. The best time to have done that was 100 years ago, and then 50 years ago, and then 20 years ago, and then today. And so we just really, I just really want to, I try and live by that philosophy, because otherwise it's just gonna be too painful to think about. And we see really dramatic positive changes happening on places like the OWA. I mean, it's not like we don't have real life, real true stories to use as guides. It's working. If you unbuild it, the salmon will come.
And they'll come quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so speaking of salmon, I have another great question here, more on the logistical side. It says, given the size of mature salmon in the Salish Sea, 10 to 15 pounds, and then the wide geographic range of the Southern residents and the wide range of salmon, what should the salmon population goal be for sustainable and flourishing orcas? It says Fraser only and or total.
Yeah, I think it's tough to come up with a single number, but maybe Giles has some ballpark estimates, but it's definitely the size of the salmon, we call that kind of the quality of the prey, definitely plays as much of a role as the number of salmon and the quantity of prey. That talking about the number of fish it would have taken to feed the whales 50 years ago is different than the number of individual fish it would take to feed the whales today, just because they're so much smaller. And things are different in every river system. And I think the hope is that with the right habitat recovery and the right, management of fisheries, that fish size could increase again as well. But it kind of they both have to be looked at in parallel. But in terms of actual numbers, I don't know if Giles, if you have anything.
No, all I have to go by is the graph that Jane Cogan put together based on the Pacific Fisheries Management numbers. And then when you're looking at how that correlates with Southern resident killer whale deaths, it does seem about 3 or 3.5 million fish are a minimum for coastwide abundance by year. That's a minimum. We see, I mean, it should be more like 6 or more. It's when they dip down to 3 or 3.5 million that we see the large numbers of deaths per year. And those are that's a those numbers are made up of different rivers and different runs through those different rivers. So that's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, I guess one other thought in terms of the Fraser River specifically is if you look at the runs, like especially pre-2005 and the numbers that we were having then, which I don't know off the top of my head, but that's, the level of fish we saw, how that would bring the whales in and how they would spend kind of those core spring and summer months here. And I think to bring them back, we would just have to return to those levels. And, even, those were already repressed runs and runs that had taken a hit compared to historic levels, but it was still, enough to at least have the southern residents here in the Salish Sea. So as a minimum starting goal, looking at what happened kind of pre that mid 2000s crash would be a place to target.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm going to take two more just so that we're keeping kind of cognizant of time here. One that I have pulled up here is what diseases are the southern residents found to have, or is the issue primarily toxins from the water?
Well, I think everybody's still trying to get a handle on that a little bit. Sorry, Monica.
No, I was just going to say that to you.
No. What we do know from breath analysis is that they've got antibiotic resistant bacteria in their breath. So we haven't looked at that for feces, but we could. The fungus that killed L95 is probably in the rest of the whales as well, or on them. But whether or not it impacts them has to do with the overall health of that individual. I think that the short answer is that that's something that NOAA is studying right now, which diseases are a problem for these guys. Also, Joe Gatos with the Sea Doc Society has been the lead with a number of other people trying to put together the health assessment database, where each of us that are doing research on these individuals and on the population, but at an individual level, trying to compile a health record, like a doctor's health record, like you have at your doctor, where you might go to a specialist for, I don't know, a wart or something, but it's going to show up in your record overall that your doctor, looking at your, weight gain or something, might be able to look at. That's the kind of thing that Joe's trying to put together for the individual whales, so that, we might be looking at certain things with our fecal samples. NOAA might be looking at other things with their fecal samples. NOAA's looking at biopsy information. John and Holly, doctors Durbin and Fernbach, are looking at overall health condition, body condition, all of these information, all of these data going into one database. And I think that once that gets really up and going, that's going to be the way for scientists to get a handle on what's actually happening to these individuals, these whales as individuals. So there is a lack of information about what's actually happening in that regard. I expect that to improve fairly quickly, though.
Well, thanks. So this last one, I'm actually going to pull two questions together that are pretty similar. One says, what organization is doing a scorecard, if any, for candidates that, have positions for pro-orca or possibly pro-habitat, some of those things that you were talking about from the political realm earlier? Is there an organization keeping up with that?
Monica, didn't you guys, your group with Susan Anderson and Cindy and you and Whitney, do something about that?
Yeah, the BOLD group, I don't think we did anything for kind of general candidates. There is a Washington Progressive Voters Guide that's issued each year that gives detailed information about incumbent candidates and what their environmental voting record has been, and also prospective candidates and kind of what their platform is. So there are definitely resources out there that are looking at environmental issues as a whole. I don't know of any that are really specific to salmon and orcas in particular, but I would suspect they go hand in hand, that people that are advocating for the environment as a major piece of their platform are probably going to be pro-salmon, pro-orca recovery.
And so keeping that in mind, is there anything specifically right now in legislation that everybody here should be following that would tie into orca conservation?
The most important thing, right, in my opinion, that people should be plugging into is the Pacific Fisheries Management Council meetings. They're available. You can look them up online. There's one on the 30th of this month. And they have a special group that's being convened, a task force that's been convened for the last maybe year and a bit, looking at the impacts of fisheries on southern resident killer whale recovery. And having the public involved in that and at least aware of that is really important. So you can look that up, Pacific PFMC, killer whale, southern resident killer whale meeting, and then you can look online and get those dates.
Awesome.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything legislatively in particular at the moment, but there are numerous public comment periods that are coming up around things like the Chehalis Dam was recent, you know, the process on the review of the Columbia River Dam systems and things like that. So there are numerous opportunities to engage and speak up on behalf of the whales and salmon. And I think all of the organizations involved try and keep, you know, we try and keep those posted on social media so people are aware of those. That kind of the Bold Action Group tries to put some comment guides out for that. And we always post those on the Orca Behavior Institute page, and Orca Network shares a lot of that as well. So there's a lot of things in the works that are going on, and as those public comment periods open up, it's just as important as voting, is engaging in those and making your voice heard. And I think all of the kind of advocacy organizations work together to try and make sure that you're aware of when those opportunities happen.
And if you're interested in specifically this issue, you can check out Wild Orca's website. We have what we're calling our Fair Fisheries campaign. That'll give you background information about this issue, and then give you kind of talking points to write your letters, and also information about who to send your letters to. So that's wildorca.org. And you can look at Eba the Whale Dog's website while you're at it.
Awesome. Eba's site is amazing. I follow it, or I follow her on Instagram. So
Yeah,
one last thing I wanted to add in, this would be in the chat thread instead of in the Q&A, but Susan Anderson did get on and provide a link for what you all were talking about earlier with the Progressive Voters card. And she's got, it looks like a council upcoming meeting. So there's probably some more information there for anybody who's interested in getting plugged in. Other than that, I mean, I know there's a lot of questions here. We can try to spend some time maybe going through and typing the answers, but you guys have provided, you know, your links and your websites. I'm sure both of your emails are there as well if anybody wants to send them directly. And then I think I'm going to turn this back over to Cindy.
Thanks, Amanda.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Giles and Monica. That was a fantastic webinar. Lots of great information. So I am going to turn it over again to Susan, and she'll kind of close this for us.
Right. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and especially Giles and Monica for sharing a little more of all the good work you do for our orcas and the salmon they need. I just wanted to follow up on something Monica had said about, you know, all the changes, and Giles as well, of the orcas not being here in June anymore. When we started Orca Month in 2007, we specifically chose June as the month to hold Orca Month because typically by then, all of the southern residents would have been back by the end of the month, and the Center for Whale Research would have their census of any new births or missing whales. And it's sad to see how that has so drastically changed. So we are actually looking at focusing more on Orca Salmon Month in October in the future. We've done that on Whidbey because that's when they're down here and in Seattle more. And I also just wanted to mention one Orca Month action that you can take that is helpful to researchers like Monika and Giles and NOAA Fisheries, and that's to report your orca sightings and other whales as well. And all of that data, the citizen science, you know, something we can all do to help is your reporting orcas goes into the data that is used to decide on critical habitat, which salmon runs the orcas are feeding on, the fact that we know the transients are around now and the southern residents aren't. So please do continue sharing your reports. I know a lot of you already do via our website, email, our Facebook page, or our 866 OrcaNet phone number. So thank you all for caring. What's been most heartening to us is to see the number of people joining in on all these webinars. And that's what gives me hope, is knowing there are so many of you out there who care and want to help. And our last webinar is next Monday at 4, and we're having a Spy Hoppy Hour. So join us with your favorite beverage, favorite orca photos, stories, short videos, and it's just going to be our social hour in the time of COVID when we can get together on Zoom and share some fun stories. So thank you again. Thanks, Cindy and Amanda. And I think that wraps it up. And there's Eva. Thank you. Thanks for all the work you do. And thanks for joining us, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. We will, we have a recording of this, so we will have it posted later on if you missed part of it or if anybody else wants to see it. So thanks, and we'll hopefully see you next Monday. Bye.
Bye.